Bipolarity has often been portrayed in mainstream culture as a matter of extremes. One moment euphoria, the next despair. But to understand the shocking truth behind the life of a bipolar person, one must step away from the simple clinical labels and enter the darker, more complex terrain of the unconscious. For psychoanalysis, bipolarity is not merely a brain disorder to be managed. It is a psychic drama unfolding between trauma, memory, and the hidden forces of desire. Sigmund Freud, in his seminal works, often pointed to the way early childhood experiences leave impressions in the psyche, impressions that resurface in symptoms, behaviors, and even in the most intense forms of suffering. The bipolar person carries within them not only a biological vulnerability, but also a history of wounds, silences, and unmet needs that continue to echo. Freud's text, Mourning and Melancholia, offers a useful doorway into this subject. He observed that in melancholia, the state we now relate to depression, the individual often internalizes a lost object, a loved one, or a sense of safety, and turns aggression inward. The pain of loss becomes a self-attack. This is not far removed from the bipolar individual, whose psyche vacillates between holding on to unbearable loss and denying it through manic intensity. In a sense, bipolarity is a double movement, a collapse under the weight of absence and a desperate flight away from it. Trauma is often at the root. A child who experiences early abandonment, neglect, or inconsistent care might learn unconsciously that love is unstable, fragile, and easily lost. This instability becomes part of their inner architecture, shaping later oscillations between hope and despair. Melanie Klein, one of Freud's most brilliant successors, deepened this view with her theory of the paranoid schizoid and depressive positions. According to Klein, the infant initially splits the world into good and bad objects, idealized love and terrifying absence. Over time, the child ideally integrates these two into a whole, realizing that the same mother who frustrates also loves. But in many cases, this integration is disrupted. When love feels too uncertain, too conditional, or too violently withdrawn, the psyche can remain caught in the split. For the bipolar individual, mania can be seen as the desperate clinging to the good object, inflating it, magnifying it, almost denying the existence of the bad object. Depression, by contrast, is the collapse into the other pole, where absence and hatred overwhelm the capacity to hold on to goodness. Donald Winnicott's reflections on the good enough mother are also crucial here. Winnicott argued that what a child most needs is not a perfect caregiver, but a reliable one. The good enough mother provides a steady environment in which the child can gradually experience frustration without collapse. If this steady presence is lacking, the child may construct what Winnicott called a false self, a mask designed to adapt, please, and survive. Mania can be seen as an extension of this false self, a performance of vitality and euphoria covering an inner emptiness. The roots of bipolarity, then, may be tied to an environment where the child was forced to create defenses too early, oscillating between desperate self-reliance and deep vulnerability. Jacques Lacan brings another dimension. For Lacan, the unconscious is structured like a language, and human desire is always marked by the lack of the other. The bipolar subject often illustrates this drama vividly. In mania, desire appears limitless. Words flow rapidly, projects multiply. It is as if the subject believes the lack can finally be overcome, that the gap between self and other can be closed. In depression, by contrast, the lack becomes unbearable, an abyss without escape. Lacan once remarked, "Man's desire is the desire of the other." And in bipolarity, we see how fragile that relationship with the other becomes, swinging from over-identification to absolute alienation. To reveal the shocking truth about a bipolar person is to admit that beneath the surface of their shifting moods lies a deeper psychic struggle. the fight to reconcile with early wounds, to integrate love and loss, to find stability in a world that once felt dangerously unstable. Their story is not simply medical, it is profoundly human, a testament to how trauma, memory, and unconscious forces shape us in ways we rarely understand. Freud himself insisted that the child is father to the man, suggesting that what we experience in those formative years continues to live within us. The bipolar individual is, in many ways, carrying the voices and absences of childhood into every adult relationship, every extreme of mood, every attempt to hold on to life's fragile meaning. And so, when we ask what truly hides behind bipolarity, we discover not only a disorder, but a history written in silence, in longing, and in the unspoken pain of the unconscious. To look at a bipolar person with psychoanalytic eyes is to see not just symptoms but stories. Stories of loss denied and rediscovered, of love longed for and feared, of an unconscious that continues to cry out for recognition. As Lacan emphasized, the unconscious insists. It returns again and again, even in the form of mania and depression. Until it is heard. To understand bipolarity, one must picture a storm that never truly ends. Within the bipolar psyche, mania and depression are not random episodes, but opposing winds colliding with ferocious intensity. Each pole carries its own truth, its own hidden function, and together they create an inner battlefield where the unconscious plays out dramas of love, loss, and survival. Freud described in Mourning and Melancholia how the psyche, when confronted with loss, sometimes refuses to accept it, turning instead towards self-reproach or manic denial. In this light, mania and depression are not accidental shifts, but two sides of the same unresolved struggle. Mania often arrives like a bright and intoxicating light. Energy bursts forth, ideas multiply, projects ignite, and the bipolar person feels temporarily liberated from the weight of their unconscious pain. But beneath this euphoria lies a powerful psychic defense. The denial of loss, the refusal to feel the emptiness that lingers beneath the surface. Freud observed that the manic state is not pure joy, but triumph after the loss of the object. In other words, the manic person acts as though they have conquered their despair, yet the triumph is hollow, built upon the fragile denial of grief. What looks like expansion is often a shield against collapse. Depression, by contrast, is the storm collapsing inwards. Energy drains away, meaning evaporates, and the bipolar person confronts what mania tried so desperately to cover up, the void left by lost love, broken attachments, and unhealed trauma. In Freud's words, in Melancholia, the shadow of the object fell upon the ego. The self becomes invaded by absence, carrying the weight of loss as though it were carved into the very fabric of identity. This inner battle is not simply chemical imbalance, it is the psyche wrestling with objects loved and hated, lost and denied. Melanie Klein's insights help us see these oscillations with sharper clarity. She proposed that the psyche is often caught between two positions: the paranoid schizoid position, where love and hate are split into extremes, and the depressive position, where the subject recognizes both sides and feels guilt, loss, and the need for repair. In bipolarity, the manic phase resembles the desperate clinging to the idealized good object, inflating it to deny the existence of the bad. Depression, however, drags the individual back into the depressive position, forcing them to face the ambivalence and pain that mania tried to erase. Thus, mania and depression are not separate illnesses, but two modes of coping with the same unresolved psychic wounds. Jacques Lacan, with his unique language of desire, offers another perspective on this storm of opposites. For Lacan, desire is always marked by lack. The other can never fully satisfy the subject's longing. In mania, the bipolar individual seems to deny this lack, behaving as if the world has no limits, as if the chain of desire could finally be completed. Words spill uncontrollably, thoughts race, projects emerge with breathtaking speed. But this is an illusion, a flight from the truth that lack is fundamental. Depression, in turn, reveals the naked face of this lack. The subject feels crushed by the impossibility of fulfillment, immobilized by the absence of desire, the unbearable awareness that nothing can close the gap. The storm, then, is the swing between the fantasy of completion and the terror of emptiness. Donald Winnicott deepens this reflection with his idea of the false self. When a child has not experienced reliable holding, they may develop a persona to adapt to the demands of the world. In mania, we see this false self on display, dazzling in its brilliance, performing vitality while hiding fragility. Depression, however, unmasks the false self, revealing the unmet needs and the authentic cry for recognition. Winnicott reminds us that beneath the manic brilliance lies the infant who was once unseen, unheard, or unheld. The bipolar storm is the adult psyche replaying this tension between performance and collapse. Consider how this storm affects relationships. In mania, bonds can feel intoxicating, almost magical. The bipolar person may idealize others, drawing them into a whirlwind of passion, plans, and promises. Yet, when depression arrives, those same bonds may feel unbearable, heavy with disappointment, or even poisonous. Klein's notion of ambivalence, the capacity to love and hate the same object, becomes painfully visible here. Mania and depression can tear relationships apart not because love is absent, but because love is felt too intensely, split between extremes that the psyche struggles to integrate. To see mania and depression as inner battles is to recognize that they are not simply symptoms to be medicated away, but psychic expressions of an ongoing struggle with love, loss, and the unconscious. Freud, Klein, Lacan, and Winnicott each illuminate different facets of this storm, but together they show us the deeper truth. Bipolarity is not just a medical diagnosis, it is a human drama. Behind the laughter of mania and the silence of depression lies the same story, a story of longing for stability in a world that once felt unstable, of craving for love that was both given and withdrawn, of attempting to reconcile with an unconscious that refuses to remain silent. And so, when we witness the oscillation between mania and depression, we are not watching random moods, but the unfolding of a profound inner narrative. The storm of opposites is, in fact, the storm of the human condition itself, the eternal movement between hope and despair, denial and confrontation, fullness and emptiness. To look at bipolarity this way is to see the person not as a victim of illness, but as a subject engaged in one of the most dramatic battles of the psyche. The storm is terrifying, yes, but it is also revealing, a window into the unconscious forces that shape all of us. Though in the bipolar person, they roar with overwhelming intensity. Mania, at first glance, looks like life at its brightest. To outsiders, the bipolar person in a manic phase may appear radiant, unstoppable, a force of creativity and energy that borders on the miraculous. Ideas flow endlessly, words sparkle, and projects emerge in a torrent of vitality. Yet this brightness is deceptive. Psychoanalysis teaches us that what appears as triumph often conceals despair, and what glitters on the surface may be hiding a profound abyss beneath. The manic mask is not simply joy, it is a defense, an armor against an inner void that threatens to engulf the subject. Sigmund Freud, in his essay Mourning and Melancholia, made a striking observation. The manic subject behaves as though a great loss had been overcome. But this triumph, Freud notes, is illusory, for the loss has not been resolved, but denied. The manic person acts as though nothing is missing, as if all wounds have healed, but the unconscious knows otherwise. The manic euphoria is not a celebration of wholeness. It is a desperate refusal to acknowledge the depth of absence. The mask of mania shines brightest where the abyss is deepest. Donald Winnicott offers a valuable lens here with his concept of the false self. When the environment fails to provide reliable holding in childhood, the child constructs a false self to meet external demands. This false self appears vibrant and capable, but it conceals a fragile, neglected true self. In mania, the bipolar individual often embodies this false self at its peak, dazzling, productive, magnetic, and even seductive in their energy. But beneath the surface lies a child, still yearning for recognition, still longing for an environment that could reliably hold their vulnerability. Mania, in this sense, is a performance, a survival strategy in which euphoria masks an abyss of unmet needs. Melanie Klein's notion of splitting also helps us understand this manic mask. For Klein, the psyche often defends itself against unbearable ambivalence by splitting experiences into all good and all bad. In depression, the bipolar person confronts the bad object, the absence, the hatred, the loss. In mania, however, the subject clings to the good object with ferocity, inflating it into something almost divine. Love, creativity, and joy are magnified, while pain is denied. Yet this inflation is unstable. The bad object has not disappeared, it is merely repressed, waiting to return. The manic mask, then, is a fragile illusion, one that can collapse at any moment into the opposite extreme. Jacques Lacan brings another layer to this picture. For Lacan, human existence is always marked by lack. The other can never fully satisfy our desire. Mania seems to stage a rebellion against this principle. The manic subject acts as if lack has been abolished, as if every desire can be fulfilled immediately, as if the world itself has no limits. Words race, as though language could finally bridge the gap of desire. Projects multiply, as if the endless pursuit could finally erase the fundamental void. Yet this is precisely what makes mania unsustainable. It rests on the illusion that lack can be conquered, that the abyss does not exist. When reality reasserts itself, depression often follows, as the subject falls back into the very emptiness they tried so hard to deny. This mask has profound consequences for relationships. To others, the manic person may appear exhilarating, even intoxicating. They can inspire, seduce, and captivate with their energy. But what is offered in mania is often not intimacy, but performance. Winnicott's false self operates here. The manic individual may give everything except their authentic vulnerability. Relationships become arenas for projection, idealization, or conquest, rather than spaces of genuine connection. The mask may win admiration, but behind it, the abyss grows lonelier, for the true self remains unseen. Yet it would be a mistake to view the manic mask only as deception. It is also a cry for survival. For many bipolar individuals, mania is the only way to keep despair at bay, the only available defense against being swallowed by the void of depression. In this sense, the mask is both destructive and protective. It hides the abyss, yes, but it also testifies to the subject's determination to live, to resist collapse, to fight against an inner darkness that threatens to annihilate them. Freud's observation that mania follows mourning reminds us that behind the mask is always grief, unprocessed, unacknowledged, yet insistently present. One might think of the manic mask as a kind of theater. On stage, the bipolar person becomes a character of brilliance, vitality, and boundless confidence. The performance dazzles the audience, but behind the curtain, backstage, lies the abyss that the show was designed to conceal. Lacan's reminder that the unconscious insists means that this abyss cannot be erased. It waits in silence, returning in dreams, slips of the tongue, or in the inevitable collapse into depression. The performance, no matter how dazzling, cannot last forever. And so the shocking truth behind mania is that its light is not pure joy, but a disguise. The euphoria hides not wholeness but fracture, not abundance but lack, not triumph but grief. To see the manic mask through the eyes of psychoanalysis is to recognize it as both a masterpiece of survival and a tragic illusion. The bipolar person, in mania, lives in a paradox. They appear most alive when they are closest to their abyss. Their brilliance is real, their creativity undeniable, but it is born out of a struggle against darkness that never ceases. To reveal this truth is not to diminish the manic experience, but to deepen our compassion for it. Behind the laughter, the rapid speech, the grand projects, and the intoxicating energy lies a subject fighting with all their strength against an unconscious wound. The mask of mania is not a lie, but a fragile attempt to keep living, even when the abyss threatens to swallow everything. And perhaps the most human thing we can do is not to be blinded by the mask, but to look gently for the person behind it, the one whose pain remains hidden, yet profoundly real. Depression is often spoken of as sadness, as though it were merely an emotional low point, an inevitable counterpart to joy. But to understand bipolar depression through the lens of psychoanalysis is to recognize that it is not simply sadness at all. It is a collapse of meaning, a psychic implosion where the unconscious rises to the surface with devastating force. If mania wears a mask to conceal the abyss, depression strips that mask away and forces the subject to confront the abyss directly. It is not the absence of feeling, but the overwhelming presence of loss, absence, and lack, all converging into a silence that becomes unbearable. Sigmund Freud, in his landmark essay Mourning and Melancholia, distinguished between mourning, a natural response to loss, and melancholia, which he described as pathological. In mourning, the lost object is gradually released, and the self learns to live without it. In melancholia, however, the loss is not fully recognized. Instead, the lost object is internalized, and the aggression toward it is turned inward. Freud wrote, "The shadow of the object fell upon the ego." In other words, the depressed person is haunted not only by absence, but by self-reproach, as though they themselves had become the lost or hated object. In bipolar depression, this mechanism becomes starkly visible. The very self is weighed down with the shadow of losses never fully processed, of griefs denied during mania, now demanding their due. Melanie Klein added a new layer to this understanding. For her, the depressive position represents a stage where the subject begins to integrate love and hate toward the same object. This integration brings with it guilt, responsibility, and the painful awareness that one can harm those one loves. In depression, the bipolar person often falls into this depressive position with crushing intensity. They may be overwhelmed with guilt, not only for what they have done, but for what they fear they might do, or even for what they unconsciously imagine. Klein reminds us that depression is not only about sadness, it is about the unbearable weight of ambivalence, the struggle to hold together love and hate, presence and absence in a single psychic frame. Donald Winnicott's reflections also resonate deeply here. He observed that when the good-enough mother is absent or inconsistent, the child may experience an inner collapse, a sense of falling endlessly without anyone there to catch them. Depression in adulthood often echoes this early catastrophe. The bipolar individual in depression may feel precisely this, as though the world has withdrawn its arms, as though no one and nothing can hold them. Winnicott's phrase, "falling forever," captures the haunting sensation of the depressive abyss, where the subject is no longer anchored in any reliable environment, either outside or within. Jacques Lacan, with his radical insight into desire, framed depression as a confrontation with the lack at the heart of human existence. For Lacan, desire is always the desire of the other, and fulfillment is never complete. In mania, the subject tries to deny this truth, acting as if lack can be abolished. In depression, however, the subject faces the lack in its most brutal form. Not only is the other absent, but even desire itself may collapse. Lacan once remarked that depression is the refusal of desire. The bipolar person in depression may feel paralyzed, not simply because they are sad, but because their very link to desire, to movement, to life itself has been severed. What remains is an unbearable void where nothing seems possible. To view depression this way is to see it not as weakness, but as a raw cry of the unconscious. The silence of depression is not empty. It is filled with echoes of unresolved trauma, of unspoken grief, of love longed for and lost. Behind the inability to rise from bed, behind the exhaustion and withdrawal, lies a psychic confrontation with truths that mania works so hard to keep at bay. It is as if the unconscious finally demands recognition. You cannot deny me forever. The abyss you fled from will return, and in depression, it does so with full force. Relationships are also profoundly affected by this depressive depth. The person in depression may withdraw from loved ones, convinced they are a burden or unworthy of care. Klein's idea of guilt surfaces here. The depressive subject may believe their very existence harms others. Winnicott would suggest that what they crave most is not solutions or advice, but holding, a presence that does not collapse under their silence. Yet such presence is difficult to offer, and so relationships may fracture under the weight of depression. To the outside world, the depressive appears absent, but inside they are drowning in too much presence. The overwhelming weight of unprocessed emotions, of the unconscious pressing down with relentless insistence. The shocking truth of bipolar depression is that it reveals the human psyche in its rawest form. Where mania dazzles with denial, depression unmasks the wound. It is the moment when the unconscious makes itself undeniable, when the shadow of every lost object becomes visible, when desire collapses into silence. To witness depression is to witness the subject stripped bare, facing the void that lies at the center of human existence. Freud, Klein, Winnicott, and Lacan each show us that depression is not an absence of life, but a confrontation with life's deepest truths. That love is fragile, that loss is inevitable, and that the unconscious will not remain hidden forever. And so, when we see a bipolar person in depression, we are not seeing weakness or laziness, but the psyche wrestling with forces that go beyond everyday comprehension. The stillness of depression is not peace. It is a storm turned inward, a cry of the unconscious that demands to be heard. To approach it with compassion is to recognize that within this silence lies a profound truth. The human need to be held, to be recognized, and to find meaning even in the darkest abyss. Depression is not just pain, it is the unconscious crying out for life, for integration, for a chance to be understood. Love is perhaps the most revealing arena in which bipolarity shows its hidden face. While mania and depression are often described in terms of energy, mood, and behavior, their deepest impact is often felt in the intimate spaces of human connection. To love while living with bipolarity is to love with extremes, moments of intensity that border on the divine, followed by crashes that feel catastrophic. Psychoanalysis, with its focus on unconscious desire and the fragility of human bonds, provides a unique lens through which to understand why love and relationships are often so turbulent in the bipolar psyche. Sigmund Freud taught us that love is never just about the other person. It is always shaped by our earliest attachments, our unconscious conflicts, and the way we internalize figures of care and authority. In Mourning and Melancholia, he showed how the loss of an object can become entangled with the ego itself, transforming grief into self-reproach. In bipolar relationships, we see this dynamic vividly. The mania of love can be intoxicating, filled with idealization and grand gestures, but beneath the surface lies a fear of loss so powerful that it shapes every bond. When the manic light fades, the depressive shadow returns, bringing self-reproach, withdrawal, and the haunting sense that one is unworthy of love. Melanie Klein's insights into ambivalence offer another way to read this turbulence. She argued that love is never pure. It is always accompanied by hatred, envy, and fear. For the bipolar person, these ambivalences are magnified. In mania, the loved one may be idealized, placed upon a pedestal as the perfect good object who can finally heal all wounds. In depression, however, the same person may feel intolerable, suffocating, even hostile. The oscillation between idealization and devaluation is not a sign of fickleness, but of the psyche's struggle to reconcile love and hate, presence and absence, security and fear. Klein reminds us that to love is to endure ambivalence, but in bipolarity, this ambivalence can swing with devastating force. Donald Winnicott adds yet another perspective with his concept of the good enough environment. For love to flourish, there must be reliability, a sense of holding, a place where vulnerability can be expressed without fear of collapse. For the bipolar person, relationships often replay the earliest failures of holding. In mania, the subject may offer dazzling affection, overwhelming the partner with passion and plans, yet this intensity may mask a desperate need to be held, a fear that the bond could vanish at any moment. In depression, the same person may retreat into silence, convinced that their very presence is destructive to the one they love. Winnicott's notion that the self longs for recognition helps us see that behind both extremes lies the same plea: see me, hold me, do not abandon me. Jacques Lacan reframes this struggle in terms of desire. For Lacan, love is always marked by the lack at the heart of human existence. We love not because the other completes us, but because they embody the gap that defines us. To love is to give what one does not have to someone who does not want it, Lacan famously said. In bipolar relationships, this paradox is magnified. In mania, the subject may act as if lack does not exist, showering the partner with gifts, promises, and declarations, as though the void could be abolished. In depression, the lack becomes unbearable. The subject may feel empty, unworthy, incapable of offering anything at all. Love, in this context, becomes a battlefield where the truth of desire, its impossibility, its fragility, is felt with brutal intensity. The shocking truth here is that bipolarity does not destroy the capacity for love. It magnifies its inherent contradictions. Every relationship is a dance between closeness and distance, presence and absence, self and other. For the bipolar person, these contradictions are lived at full volume. Mania may bring euphoric connection, as though the couple were fused into one radiant whole. Depression, however, reveals the impossibility of fusion, leaving the bipolar subject feeling isolated and unloved, even within intimacy. The partner may feel bewildered, whiplashed between being adored and being pushed away. Yet this turbulence is not arbitrary. It is the unconscious repeating its unresolved dramas through the medium of love. Relationships also bring to light the bipolar subject's relationship with themselves. Freud once remarked that self-love is the prototype of all love. In depression, when the self is attacked by the shadow of the lost object, the ability to love others collapses. In mania, the self may inflate, projecting its vitality outward. But this inflation is unstable, vulnerable to collapse. Klein would remind us that genuine love requires integration, the ability to see the other as both good and bad, as both present and absent, without swinging into extremes. For the bipolar psyche, this integration is precisely the challenge. And yet, within this turbulence lies a profound truth. The intensity of bipolar love is not a defect. It is a window into the depth of human longing. To love with such extremes is to reveal how fragile, how necessary, how desperately sought connection truly is. Winnicott's reminder that the true self emerges only when it is recognized tells us that even in the chaos of bipolar relationships, there is an authentic cry for recognition, for a bond that can hold through both mania and depression. Lacan's insistence that love is always tied to lack tells us that this cry is universal, though the bipolar subject feels it with overwhelming clarity. To witness love in the bipolar psyche is to witness love at its most raw, stripped of illusions of stability, exposed in its contradictions, both intoxicating and devastating. It shows us that love is never simple, never smooth, but always a negotiation with the unconscious, with desire, with absence. The bipolar subject, in their oscillation between mania and depression, reveals what is hidden in all of us, that to love is to risk collapse, to risk loss, to risk everything, and yet to keep longing nonetheless. In the depths of bipolar existence, depression emerges not merely as a passing sadness, but as a profound collapse of the psychic scaffolding that holds a person's sense of self together. It is not about feeling down after a disappointment, nor is it simply the heaviness of ordinary grief. Instead, it is closer to what Freud, in his seminal work Mourning and Melancholia, described as a state where the ego itself feels impoverished, stripped of its capacity to love, to create, to desire. Freud observed that in melancholia, the shadow of the lost object falls upon the ego, and the self becomes inseparable from what has been lost. In bipolar depression, this phenomenon is magnified. The loss is not always external, but often internal, tied to an elusive sense of identity, stability, and continuity. What is lost is often the very ability to trust that joy can return. The unconscious turns inward, and the cry of depression becomes not only a cry for help, but a cry against the void itself. Lacan deepened this understanding by introducing the concept of lack, which is not just an emptiness to be filled, but the structural condition of human desire. In depression, this lack becomes unbearable. The manic high that once tried to cover it up collapses, leaving the subject face to face with the rawness of existence without a veil. This confrontation with the lack of meaning often leads to the sense that life is drained of its significance. The depressive phase is, therefore, not merely an imbalance of chemicals, but a profound existential encounter, where the subject struggles with the impossibility of satisfying desire and the unbearable weight of the other's absence. It is no wonder that individuals in this state often describe their experience as falling into a bottomless pit or being engulfed by an invisible force they cannot fight. Melanie Klein's insights also shed light on this dimension of bipolar depression. For Klein, the psyche oscillates between two fundamental positions, the paranoid schizoid and the depressive. In the depressive position, the individual realizes the ambivalence of love and hate toward the same object, recognizing the possibility of loss, damage, and separation. For those with bipolar disorder, this ambivalence becomes intolerable. The depressive phase is an overwhelming immersion in the depressive position, where guilt, despair, and feelings of unworthiness dominate. The individual may feel responsible for destroying the loved object, whether that is a relationship, a sense of self, or even hope for the future. Klein's description resonates deeply with the testimonies of people experiencing bipolar depression, who often report feeling as though they themselves are broken beyond repair. Donald Winnicott offers yet another angle with his notion of the true self and the false self. Depression, for him, could emerge when the false self, constructed to appease external demands and maintain appearances, collapses, leaving the individual stranded without access to the vitality of the true self. In bipolar depression, after the manic flight fueled by the false self, the crash often strips away all defenses, leaving the person painfully aware of the gap between how they appear and who they truly are. This collapse can be both devastating and, paradoxically, an opportunity. It is in this raw encounter with emptiness that psychoanalysis seeks to help the individual rediscover fragments of the true self, not by denying the void, but by giving it a place within the narrative of their life. It is also crucial to see depression in bipolar disorder as a form of communication. While it often appears as silence, withdrawal, and an inability to engage with the world, it carries a message from the unconscious. It says, "Something essential has been lost, and I cannot continue as before." Freud once remarked that melancholia has the peculiar quality of making the ego feel worthless. But this feeling, while painful, also reveals the depth of the subject's attachment to what has been lost. In this way, depression is both a symptom and a signpost. It signals where desire has faltered, where love has been fractured, and where meaning has collapsed. What makes this phase particularly shocking is its contrast with mania. The brilliance of the manic period, with its creativity, energy, and grandiosity, often dazzles those around the individual. Yet depression reveals the hidden cost of such brilliance, the emptiness it tries to cover. The oscillation between mania and depression thus mirrors the fundamental human struggle between presence and absence, desire and loss, fullness and emptiness. Bipolar depression is not an isolated phenomenon. It is the unveiling of the unconscious drama that mania worked so hard to conceal. One patient described it poignantly, "When I am depressed, I am not simply sad. I feel as though the world has lost all its colors, and I am trapped in a gray fog. The things I once loved feel distant, like echoes of another life." This testimony captures the essence of the depressive cry. Not a cry for superficial comfort, but for a reawakening of meaning. Psychoanalysis does not offer quick fixes here. Instead, it invites the individual to explore the layers of this silence, to listen to what the unconscious is demanding, and to begin weaving new narratives that can hold together the fragments of the self. The truth, then, behind bipolar depression is that it is not a weakness nor a mere medical condition, but a profound psychic state that reveals the raw reality of the human condition. It exposes the fragility of meaning, the weight of loss, and the haunting power of the unconscious. It is a cry that demands not only treatment, but understanding, a call to recognize that beneath the silence of depression lies the most intimate struggle for existence itself. If this exploration opened your eyes to the hidden truths of the mind, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next deep dive into psychology and the human condition. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or personal experiences. Your voice could inspire someone else. And if you found this video meaningful, share it with a friend who might need these insights today. Together, we can build a community that embraces knowledge, healing, and self-discovery. Stay tuned. There's so much more.